Bruce Craven will discuss his decision to use fictional narratives to teach leadership to graduate business students and how these, how these leadership and life lessons can apply to everyone. For close to 30 years, Craven has worked in two apparently different fields, teaching executive education while pursuing independent projects in writing. The lessons he learned while living in these two worlds inspired him to create his popular Columbia Business School elective, Leadership Through Fiction, which ultimately led to the writing of his book, Win or Die, Leadership Secrets from Game of Thrones. As a member of the Columbia Business School Executive Education Facility, Craven also serves as program director of the Advanced Management Program and faculty advisor of several custom executive education programs. He will also be releasing a book of poetry in 2019, which I think he might tell you a little bit about. He studied politics and literature at UC Santa Cruz and received his MFA in writing from Columbia School of Arts. And he now lives right here in the desert with his two sons and wife. Bruce, welcome. Help me welcome Bruce to the stage.
Awesome. That was great. Thank you. All right. I'm just going to set up my timer here so I'm aware of the time, and then we're going to roll. I grew up, thank you everyone for being here, by the way. I grew up in La Cañada, California, so not too far from here. Was born in Burbank, and came out here my whole childhood with my parents and their group of friends from their Presbyterian church. In college, I came out and camped in Joshua Tree. When I met the woman that would become my wife 13 years ago, I convinced her, first of all, to come out here twice on vacations, once when she was pregnant, and we drove out in my vintage Mercury without air conditioning in the spring. And then amazingly enough, I convinced her to come out the next year with a brand new baby in essentially a hand-me-down Toyota that was just a piece of junk and had no air conditioning. It was 123 when we got to our hotel in Desert Hot Springs, and I said, "Hey, honey, do you want to move? Do you want to move out here?" And she said no. And then we got married in Palm Springs. We had a fabulous wedding in downtown Palm Springs where everyone came in and stayed at different little kind of boutique hotels, and we had the wedding and ceremony at a hotel there. And then I remember that day because the day before I went up on the gondola for the first time and was looking down at the valley. And I said to these friends of mine from New York, someday I've got to move here. I don't know when I'll ever be able to do it, but someday I'll have to do that. And 6 months later, my wife, out of the blue, we were in Pasadena, said, "What do you think about moving to Coachella Valley?" And I went, I am in, right? And at the same time, Columbia Business School had given me a new job, which I hadn't really expected. I had quit working there after many, many years, and they came back with a better job offer. So I looked like a very smart negotiator. And I said, "You need me to move to New York?" And they said, "You can live wherever you want." So for our initial time, I was flying back and forth, and she was commuting to San Dimas. And now she runs my business. I fly to New York. I was just in New York for a month and got back Friday night. And our two sons go to Palm Valley, a school that we love. And they both play AAU basketball for a team loosely affiliated with Rancho Mirage High. So kind of a dreams become true that this is my home. And speaking here, I have to say, it's a bit of a dream too. We are going to talk about the book, Win or Die, at a certain point. I'm also going to talk about the course that I teach at Columbia Business School that contributed to the creation of this book. I teach a course called Leadership Through Fiction, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. This editor named Stephen Power reached out to me 5 years ago. He was with a small press in New York, and they couldn't offer me any legal protection if something were to come up with HBO or the publisher of the books by George R. R. Martin. And I ended up not signing a contract with them. But Stephen and I stayed in touch, and during those 5 years, I kept working on the book and doing versions of it and talking to other editors. And the fall of 2017, it really looked like no doors were going to open for this project. And I called my wife from New York. I was standing on the Columbia campus, and I said, I never say this, honey, but sometimes you just got to let something go. I just don't think this is going to happen. And that night, I walked with my group of executives into Harlem to a famous jazz club called Minton's. And the editor, Stephen, who I'd been out of touch with, wrote back and said, I really want to do that book. Here's your offer. And the problem is you've got to get it written by the summer of 2018. So last summer, and I had a crazy schedule, and I was working on it nonstop. I should have put a picture in this slideshow of my wife, who's a chartered financial analyst, and she instantly had a whole wall of Excel kind of calendar sheets showing when I had to hit the conclusion of each chapter. Now, I've got an MFA in poetry. My first novel, which was published many years ago, which I'll reference, well, anyway, I'll talk about that. But, as a novelist, poet, we don't tend to do things in real scheduled ways, at least not the people I know. But I tried to honor her commitment, and I tried to write according to that schedule. And as hard as I tried, we still, last summer, were just hustling to finish this manuscript. And I remember the day we finished it, we sent it off, and she was helping me with it, with final edits and things. We sent it off, and the editor wrote back and said, great job, guys. I remember I dropped my head on the table thinking, I can't believe we got through it. And so this book is dedicated, it's dedicated to my wife, dedicated to Sherelle, my Khaleesi, and mother of our 2 dragons. So if you know the show, I'm already getting teary-eyed, I haven't even started. So anyway, we're going to talk about also the course that I teach, and really what I want you to be able to come out of here with is a sense that you can, if you're here, you obviously love literature, you love fiction, you love narrative in film, whatever format. I want you to come out of this with a sense of how you can continue to use that love to build your own leadership, your leadership of yourself and your leadership of your colleagues at work, your leadership of your family, leadership of people that matter to you, your not-for-profits, whatever it is you do. My MBA students, when I first started this class, it was summer of 2012, and I'd been trying for a long time to get the okay. I was about to drive my son, my older son, he was probably about 5 then, to his martial arts class in Desert Hot Springs. And this professor, colleague of mine, wrote me an email and said, did you ever present that class suggestion to Columbia Business School? Because they're looking for something new. And I said, I didn't, but I'm going to make up that syllabus right now. And I was literally created the course idea, sent it off to him, and before I knew it, I was in New York, flying out every week from Palm Springs through Denver to New York, and then teaching a 3.5-hour workshop, and then flying back. Just to give you some perspective of that, at one point I was teaching south of Frankfurt, Germany. I took like an hour-and-a-half car ride to Frankfurt, flew to New York, got to my hotel in Harlem quicker than I do from Palm Springs. But as I said to everyone, I'm the one that loves living here and loves working there, so I can't complain about that. And there was a moment, it was about the 5th class, and this one student, all my students keep journals, so basically like a black moleskin journal, and they all write in it, and they sort of use it in their own way to capture the leadership ideas. And she came up to me, I remember we were standing out in the Broadway entrance to Columbia University, and she said, oh, professor, this class is unlike anything we've ever taken at the business school. And it was the first moment I thought the class was actually working. I was about 5 weeks in, and I called my wife and I said, I think this might be working. A parallel story. The first moment that I brought up the Game of Thrones characters on my PowerPoint presentation with Columbia MBAs was probably 3 years before I really had the contract to write the book. And I brought up all the characters, and everyone in the class of 50 students started cheering. And so I ran right out and called my wife, and I said, I got to write this book, because people are psyched. I think we can all choose to engage with fiction, and we can, develop our ability to be leaders. And I've had students come to me over and over again saying that what we've practiced in the class and what we're going to talk about this afternoon gave them a lens and sort of a proactive capacity to start applying that to other shows and other novels. And one of the exercises I have the students do, it's called a visual fiction project, and they pick a film or a show, a TV show, something that they are really drawn to, and they create a leadership presentation from it. And I've had people do it from everything from Buffy the Vampire Slayer to, The Americans or something. And people, Orange is the New Black. And people find these great insights. And so I hope after just our brief time today, you'll be able to go back and start watching things maybe with that new lens. As I said, I wrote Win or Die alternately either in New York City or here in the Valley, primarily here in the Valley. I was invited in January to record the audio version of the book, which was both totally intimidating and kind of exciting. And this image here was Super Bowl Sunday, and it was the final day, I think, of 5 days, and I'd taken my young son, Walker, into the studio to practice recording, himself reading a little bit of the book. Then he left, and I got to the final page, so, 293 pages. I got to the final page, and my voice went out, and I was just, I was like drinking water, and I had lozenges, and the guy that runs the facility is a wonderful guy, and he's used to musicians. He's a musician, and he was kind of like, dude, just go sit outside for a while. And then I'd come back, and I'd go to the final page, and I'd go, and Daenerys Targaryen, my voice, But eventually I got through. And so if you ever know of anyone that prefers the audio, I was a part of that process. So when we first moved out here, my wife and I, my colleague at Columbia Business School approached me on the idea of writing a business case about Ferguson, which is a building supply company. There's a couple outlets here. There's one on 111. And we had worked with a senior executive from the credit function, a guy named John, wonderful guy. And so I ended up going up to Vegas and meeting their group on an off-site and doing a lot of things and wrote this case, which took a massive amount of time for just being whatever it is, an 18-page case. And as I was writing it, I kept trying to bring some of my own experience as a novelist and screenwriter into that case process until I realized, well, that's really not what a case requires. It's a very specific learning methodology and a learning tool, and it's wonderful, right? But I came out of it thinking, God, what if we could use books, novels? What if we could use films? What if we could use plays? What I didn't know was that at Harvard Business School, there's a man named Joseph Badaracco who had been doing that. He'd been teaching a class sort of on a creative moment of intuition. He'd assigned Joseph Conrad's The Secret Sharer, if I'm remembering the title correctly, about a captain who's on a boat and he's new to his leadership role, and someone escapes from another boat and arrives insisting that he was going to be unfairly executed for a murder he didn't commit on the other boat. And this captain chooses to shield this person rather than follow the official protocol and hand him over to the other boat, the authorities on the other boat. And so Joseph Badaracco used that in this group of, I believe it was a board of people who all responded well to that idea, and then he started teaching it to graduate students. So when I was teaching my class, I felt I was on the forefront of something that had never been done. I found out later through different people that were doing research in that field that I was on the forefront, but there was this Professor Badaracco who had started it, as far as I know, and he wrote a wonderful book about it called Questions of Character. I came to New York City in 1985, straight out of UC Santa Cruz with very little warning. Arrived in New York City with a duffel bag at Newark Airlines, at Newark Airport. Arrived in New York City. I don't know how many people are familiar with the city, but I instantly was lost the moment I crossed the street. It took me a while to process it, and I loved it. I just fell in love with New York, and I was at Columbia studying with wonderful writers, and I was living this sort of fringe writer life where, I lived on very little money. I read poetry all day. I wrote fiction. And as you can imagine, when I graduated, I needed a job. And I ended up getting hired by Columbia Business School. I thought I would be there for maybe 6 months. And about 2 months ago, I was sent a Tiffany's decanter to symbolize and thank me for my 30 years with the school. So now, some of those 30 years, I was a contracted person living back in Burbank and Hollywood and working as a screenwriter. couple of those 30 years, I was working as a bartender in New York's East Village, yet I always had a foot in that business because I loved it. And I remember early on, this character you're looking at, this picture, he had to cut his hair, first of all, to work at his new job. And a lot of my artistic friends were saying, well, how, you're a novelist. Why are you working in business? And I said, I don't know. I just find it really fascinating. And part of it was that I was working on programs with people from all around the world. So when I got married here in Palm Springs, a Columbia professor of great renown said at my wedding, I'd worked with people from every functioning economy around the world. And that's true. And that gave me, it triggered my excitement initially. And then over the years, it gave me a great gift of understanding how much people are the same, regardless of where you're from, regardless of your culture, regardless of your religion. I've just had the benefit of working with, hardworking, intelligent, committed, relatively successful people from around the world, and there's something that's given me a lot of strength in that. Back in these days, I decided I was going to try to write a novel. I thought being a novelist would be a good way for me to go forward. And as I started to work at Columbia Business School, I wrote this novel called Fast Sofa. It was a Generation X novel. It's about a guy who is, much like most of my friends, including myself, didn't want to grow up very quickly. And we would do a lot of road trips. We were all very influenced by Hunter Thompson and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And we kind of loved the West, and we loved jumping in our cars and sort of breaking all the rules and driving all over the place. But in the novel, in the writing of the novel, I realized that the main character, Rick Jeffers, needed to grow up. I didn't want to grow up. Even when I was writing the novel, I remember one of my best friends was living in the Virgin Islands, where I'd been for a while, and I thought, why can't I just be in the Virgin Islands having fun? And I realized, no, at a certain point, you need to be responsible and you need to grow up. And writing that novel helped me kind of come to terms with responsibility. We fought for like 9 years to get a movie made. We eventually did get the movie made, starring Jake Busey, Jennifer Tilly, Crispin Glover, some great cameos, Eric Roberts, and it was filmed in Los Angeles and here in Palm Springs. We actually stayed, the Ace Hotel, before it was the incredibly cool Ace, was a very battered hotel with no air conditioning. And I was actually there the day that they shot this scene, which is a car crash scene. And I had already got in my vintage car and driven back to LA because I was like, I can't just sit here and sweat all day long. But the story is really about responsibility. The main character, Rick, has sort of a glamorous, poetic, fabulous kind of appreciation of all the qualities of LA that other people don't appreciate, but he struggles with being responsible. And he meets this homeless ornithologist, so someone that loves birds and had been part of a family-run bird pet store, which was played by Crispin Glover. And eventually they go back to Arcadia to visit what was called the House of Birds, which was Jules Langdon is Crispin's character, which was Jules' family's bird store. And Jules sees that it's not being run to the standards that his family used to run it. It gave me, a 31-year-old guy working in executive education, the opportunity to fit in executive business development language into what's essentially a road trip story. But it was an important part of the story to me because Jules gets reactive. He becomes derailed. I don't want to give away too many things, but he steals a hawk. And a lot of what happens in this story is the characters don't know how to kind of control themselves and understand themselves, and they pay a big price for that. In my MBA course, the one that I just taught to executive MBAs a few months back, I start with a book that's actually nonfiction, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And I don't know how many people have had a chance to read it, but if you haven't, I would strongly recommend you read this book. Some of you certainly know some of the story of Douglass. There's a new actual biography out about him that's exceptional. But he was born into slavery, pre-Civil War. At one point, the slave master's wife starts to teach him to read, and she's the first person in his very young life who's treated him with any warmth. And then her husband comes in and says, you can't teach them to read. That'll ruin them, for the life that they're supposed to live. And so to Douglas's credit, he was about 9 years old or something. He goes, hey, if reading is so dangerous to them, I need to learn how to do it. And he starts bribing little white boys he had some access to food briefly. He starts bribing them to teach him to read. He kind of focuses on this idea, and he learns to read. He eventually, as he grows older, plans an escape. He's caught in his first escape, and rather than give up, he decides he's going to find his way to freedom. And he said the hardest thing for him during those periods of time was knowing that freedom was there and yet not being able to just go instantly because he knew the risks were too high and he had to handle it strategically. So knowing you have a goal and knowing that that goal means everything to you, but then also controlling yourself to be able to get to that goal. And in my class with the MBA and executive MBA students, they've all got these great ambitious goals. I mean, far more than really, I'm awed to be in the class with most of them. And it's because they have huge ambitions and huge goals. And what's the one thing that they admit almost instantly that holds them back? It's fear. They know, well, what if I say I'm going to do this, but then I try and I can't do it? What if I do this startup and I mismanage it and I look like an idiot to the people I love? And so we use Douglas's narrative as a way to talk about how we all have to face our fear. And if we don't face our fear, if we don't fight, and Douglas fought both physically against slave breakers that were oppressing him, and he fought mentally against kind of this sense that there was no way to escape slavery. But if we don't fight to achieve our goals, we're going to fail. And when I was writing this book, I've had a photograph of Douglas on my desk for many years, but I had written right on it, fight or fail. And every day I was going in saying, listen, nothing I'm doing is comparable to what he had to fight against, but I have to fight to make this dream come true. There's a concept that I think is related to that we use a lot, which is called player versus victim. And really the way to look at that is that in our lives, if you take Viktor Frankl, who was in the concentration camps during World War II, he said there were people in the horrible situations that they faced, just life or death, terrifying situations. He said there were people that always insisted on making the choice that they felt was the right choice for them morally and purposefully, even if it put their lives at risk. And he said there were other people that made the choice no matter what to survive, even if it meant betraying, the values they probably would have espoused outside of the concentration camp. And Frankl was arguing that we always have choice. And player versus victim is that idea that we always have choice. Now, a lighthearted version of that, I fly back and forth all the time, as I mentioned, and I'm sure everyone in the room can have examples of this. When you're in the airport and suddenly the flights start getting canceled and you realize you're not going to, meet your sons in Las Vegas for a basketball tournament, but you're going to be in Omaha for like 14 hours. And you've been around the people that fall apart, that blame it on the system, blame it on the airline, blame it on the way fate is always against them. They fall into that victim mentality. When I had difficulty publishing the second novel I wrote, the publishing industry was transforming. And rather than look at it as an opportunity, I fell into this victim mindset of complaining, well, I'm never going to get a book published now. The industry's in turmoil. If it was 5 years earlier, I'd be more successful. I fell into making excuses. And the player versus victim is really a reminder that we always have the capacity to choose. I find that I apply it to almost every, just last week when I was co-running this advanced management program with senior executives, I was hitting points where I just wanted to get on a plane and go home. I just wanted to see my wife and my kids. And that's a very human feeling. And I had to keep going, hey, this is a player moment. Just don't start complaining and being a victim. And I found that this idea is something we can all repeat to remind ourselves to pursue our goals. Douglas, when President Lincoln was assassinated, Mary Lincoln gave his walking stick to Douglas. Douglas, after escaping freedom, ran a press. He was an advocate to the president during the Civil War, arguing for the rights of African Americans to fight. He's considered probably one of the best traveled people of his time, along with Mark Twain, and probably along with Twain, one of the people that spoke to the most audiences around the country. So it's pretty phenomenal when you think here was someone born with nothing, with just no opportunity, everything taken from him, and he continued to find ways to be actionable and proactive. And so in my class, we really use that as a way to set the bar for everyone, and I know I use him as a source of constant inspiration. I haven't been able to go there yet, but this is the home he lived in when he, at the end of his life, and it's now a museum. In this book, Win or Die, there's little segments towards the end of each chapter that draw on the work of Joseph Campbell. So Joseph Campbell was a mythologist, really a comparatist. Like he was looking at a lot of different mythologies and religions and different stories from across cultures, and he was bringing them together with the idea that he could find this common thread that went through them. And along the way, I use Joseph Campbell as a way to drive to my students the importance of having courage, because in Campbell's common thread, which is also known as the hero's journey or the monomyth, there's this idea that in all these different religions, different stories, different myths, different narratives from cultures all around the world, the hero always has to step out and has to accept the challenge, or the heroine has to step out and accept the challenge. If you look at George Lucas's first film, Star Wars, Luke Skywalker meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, hands him his lightsaber and says, "You need to be like your father, and you need to become a Jedi Knight." And Luke says no. And then he returns to his step-parents and sees that the stormtroopers have murdered them, and at that moment, he chooses to accept this journey, whatever it's going to be, and he crosses into this new world. So in the hero's journey, there's sort of three stages. There's separation, leaving the world you know. There's initiation, kind of learning in this new world. And then there's return, coming back and being able to bring back what Campbell called boons or gifts. What you've learned, you're bringing that back to your community. When I talk to my senior executives, I say, listen, you're all on a hero's journey now. You've been here for a month. You left Italy. You left Brazil. You left Hong Kong, wherever it might have been. You've come here. You've entered this strange new world. You've worked with all these new people, developing skills, and now you're returning home. And that's, in its own way, a kind of a hero's journey. Courage is a big part of that. The courage to decide, I want something, and I'm going to fight to get it. Campbell was fascinated by, initially as a young boy, and even as he grew up, was fascinated by the Native Americans on the prairies, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and their culture. And they had I don't know if tradition's the right word, but during battle they would do something called counting coup. And so imagine, if you will, the American, European cavalry, and they're out on the plains, and then you have the Native Americans, and there's this clash of cultures. The Native Americans aren't building cities, they're roaming around, they're nomadic with their horses and hunting buffalo, they have everything they need. The European Americans are sort of moving in very linear lines, putting in train tracks, building cities. And so even when there were times of goodwill, there was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of tension, and there was a lot of war. And at certain points, the American cavalry soldiers were baffled by how the prairie Indians would ride in, duck their bullets, duck their swords, duck everything, get all the way up to them, and then hit them with a little leather thong, yell in their face, and ride away. And they're like, what the hell? Like, I thought we were trying to kill each other. What is that, right? And then later it became known to them that this was called counting coup, and it was a effort to prove on the part of particularly the younger Native American warriors, their courage. So they would say, I'm going to get as close to you as I can to where I could kill you, and you could kill me, and I'm not even going to bother because I don't even care about you. I'm just showing my courage. And we talk about this in my class as a way to remind ourselves, tune ourselves up for the fact that we can ask more of ourselves in the way of courage. I have days where I get up at home and I'm like, I just want to put on some NBA basketball and sit on the sofa and have a beer and and it's like, no, this is one of those times I've got to ask more of myself. I've got to confront the things that scare me and trouble me. And so we use courage as a way to motivate and encourage ourselves to be more resilient. So Campbell's hero's journey can be a reminder to you to be courageous and that you should have to expect to be courageous. It's not going to be easy, right? The idea that it's supposed to be easy and you're supposed to have everything handed to you is the wrong approach. We want to recognize that courage is a part of the challenge, and to be resilient, we need courage. I mentioned George Lucas and Star Wars. He had made American Graffiti, which was a highly successful film. I mean, I'm old enough that I remember watching it right around the time it came out. It cost nothing to make. It was set in the Central Valley in California. It was about high school kids driving around in cars, no special effects, won a lot of awards. Producers wanted him to go out and make another movie like that, Put the kids on surfboards, Put them in a sailboat. It doesn't really matter. This is what you do. You win awards, you make money, it costs nothing, right? And he said, no. I want to do a space opera. He initially was going to work on Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, but that didn't pan out. So he took his urge to kind of do something big, and he said, I'm going to do kind of a space opera, something that captures the excitement I felt as a young boy watching films and watching TV. And this was really a hero's journey for him because there was no technology. At that time in the 70s, all the movies honestly that I love, were primarily Jack Nicholson and Robert De Niro type stories with, struggling protagonists fighting omniscient systems that they don't understand and then eventually dying at the end. There had been Jaws, which was successful, but in terms of special effects, Jaws had just this giant inflatable plastic shark that Steven Spielberg had to film around. I mean, he couldn't really use it. He used it at the end, and it worked in 1978, but if we watched it now, we'll laugh at it. But Lucas created a whole special effects group. So he went through an amazing amount of adversity and his own hero's journey to do something that at the time was unheard of, and he transformed the film industry, as we know by all the similar films that are out there now. So the Campbell hero's journey is also known as a monomyth, and it comes in 17 stages. By the way, if anyone wants these slides afterwards, just let me know and I'll email them to you if it'd be a great resource for you. So in my book here, I address all of the 17 stages in different ways, kind of in these little sort of mini segments at the end of each chapter. But I developed a workshop, which I didn't know if it was going to kind of pan out, but it ended up working, where executives envision themselves on their own hero's journey. So either graduate students or executives, you guys could do it. I describe it in here. But the idea is to write 5 10-minute sections where you're envisioning yourself in the future. So the future could be tomorrow, right? The future could be next week, but you write 10 minutes on everything is stable. So for me, that could be I could tell you, it's going to Burgers and Beer with my wife and kids on Dinah Shore. It's, then going and hiking with my dog up in the desert. There's a series of things that for me symbolize stability and everything nice. Then you write a 10-minute stage of looming crisis. So what's the problem that could bubble up? It could be professional, it could be personal, it could have to do with your health, it could have to do with your family, it could have to do with your job, whatever it might be. And then you write a 10-minute section where you're not facing the challenge. You're not finding the resolve to step up and confront that challenge. Then you write a 10-minute section where you actually do face that. And usually it's internal things we have to face. It's fear, it's doubt, it's insecurity. And then you write a final stage where you envision yourself succeeding. And the point of this exercise is to tune ourselves up to the need for courage and to tune ourselves up to what we can ask of ourselves in terms of being resilient when things don't go our way. So it's a workshop that I've been using for many years. I entirely invite you to practice it with yourself, with friends, with family, with people at work. A phrase that's associated with Campbell that really resonates to me is the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. And so Campbell was really arguing that, go find the thing you really want and then have the courage to pursue it. And when you do that, doors are going to open, but you're going to have to be willing to confront what scares you and what intimidates you. I'm happy to say that one of the books that's in my course, Revolutionary Road, is for sale in the bookshop back there for $1. So I asked the woman at the front desk, I said, please hold this because I know someone's going to come in and buy this book because it's an amazing book. Some of you might have read it at different times. It came out in the early 60s. It's about this couple, Frank and April Wheeler in Connecticut, in this very kind of beautiful suburban area with young kids. He's got a job that's not ideal and kind of boring, and he thinks he's above it. His wife thinks he's above it too. She's pursuing some acting, but they don't really know what they want from life. They kind of fall into this comfort zone of drinking a little too much with their neighbors and making fun of how they're not part of this suburban world that they live in. But they don't really know what world they want to be in. It's an incredibly good film, an adaptation of the novel with Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. And Kate Winslet saw it as really a fight for a woman who wanted to transform herself, and I think she's right. But there's a very dark side to the story because they struggle with honesty, and they struggle with that ability to truly communicate with each other. I think April Wheeler does a much better job of it than her husband Frank. Frank was raised by a father who's very distant. He, in the early 60s, this could still be true now, but in the early 60s, he has this ideal of what manliness should be and what he should be like as a man. He sees himself needing to be both adventurous and utterly unique and at the same time sort of traditionally male. He was in the end of World War II, so he's got some of the glamour of being a returning soldier, but he really doesn't know what he wants in his life. And when the story starts, the novel and the film, and I'll try not to give away too much because it's so good, but they're in conflict. And Frank handles the conflict one way that you might disagree with. April comes out of the conflict thinking, hey, we need to act. We need to go find a new life. And her idea is we need to go to Paris because Paris is where Frank has always said he felt kind of the most aligned in himself, the most kind of real. And so she wants to take him to Paris. What happens is some professional things develop, and Frank isn't so sure he wants to go to Paris, but he's not very effective at being honest with her about it. He's really kind of stuck in this idea that he needs to be a man and that being a man involves not admitting that he's unsure or admitting that he's scared or admitting that he has doubts. In one of my classes, I was lucky enough to work with a man who's now CEO of Hachette, a huge publishing company in Europe, and he said the value of manliness in Frank leads to the destruction of honesty. And one way to look at this is when we have moments of conflict, we have options, and in this story, what starts up, Frank acts one way, which I won't go into, and April has this idea of Paris. And suddenly they align themselves around this vision, that they're going to go to Paris and they're going to find their way through it. And they're both sort of, their love is stronger, their sense of excitement, their sense of adventure is stronger. Now you could argue, because I use this with my business students, and they're all pointing out, yeah, but it's so badly thought out. It's so, so badly planned. And those things are true, but there's an opportunity there. And there's a gratitude because they've got this new vision, they love each other, and then there's another moment in the narrative where they need to be honest. And Frank in particular is not honest with April. She's pregnant, and so the question is, can they go to Paris and have the baby in Paris and still make this work? And April doesn't see why they can't. People have babies in Paris. And Frank really is struggling with the fact that he's been given a job offer, a promotion at his company, and maybe he doesn't want to go to Paris and be a unique individual. Maybe he wants to stay in Connecticut where he makes a lot of money and people respect him. But he's unable to kind of voice that confusion to his romantic partner. And what we do in the class is we bring out the scripts, and people pair up and they read the lines as they're written. And at a certain moment, April says, "Frank, do you really want to have another baby?" And it's a very vulnerable, open statement. And Leonardo DiCaprio plays it beautifully in the movie because you can see across his face that he doesn't know. He doesn't know if he wants another baby. He doesn't know anything. But then he turns and he judges her. He goes, how could any woman say that? How could you be a mother and say that? And he pushes away this one moment where honesty could have opened up the opportunity for them to talk about new possibilities. And so in the class, we have people role play that, and then Frank turns and instead of saying, how could you say that? He says, I don't know, or I'm scared, or help me, I'm confused. And they see if they can come up with better solutions. And they do. Some of the solutions are a little crazy, but they come up with greater ideas because often honesty is the way, both in romantic life and in professional life, if we work with people, and I'm not talking about confessional, constant confessing. That's annoying, right? No one needs that, right? Here's my opinion, here's my mood, here's my opinion, here's my mood. Not that, but moments where honesty that reveals what you really care about can open up and strengthen a relationship with each other. And Frank isn't able to do that, and it costs both of them a very high price. In the class, though, it's very energizing when people get in and start sort of playing the roles together and finding that honesty can leverage new solutions. So Joseph Campbell famously said, I don't believe people are looking for the meaning of life as much as they're looking for the experience of being alive. And I would argue that's part of the appeal of Game of Thrones. You guys can all applaud now because it's up on the screen. But because the stakes in Game of Thrones are so high all the time. I mean, every minute, whether you're born into a wealthy family like the Lannisters, or you're born into a disenfranchised family like Daenerys Targaryen and her brother Viserys, it's an intense world, and they're constantly in situations of crisis where the stakes are very high, the opposing forces are threatening them. And one of the things we talk about in the class and they talk about in the book is this idea of emotional intelligence and how we can use emotional intelligence to help us in times of crises. And I would argue we can use EQ is the shorthand for it. We can use EQ all the time. It was developed by Daniel Goleman. It was in the early 90s. He wrote about it. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. There's a number of books that have been written about it. You can always find one in the airport. Harvard Business Review has, I think, a whole collection of EQ-based articles. It's fascinating. And it's really this idea that there's IQ, really this kind of cognitive, deductive ability, which we're often tested on and which is important to much of what we do. But there's also this emotional intelligence, this ability to be, self-aware, be able to manage ourselves with other people, to be able to understand other people, to be able to build relationships with people. And in Goleman's research, he said that often in organizations, the people that rose to the top and stayed there were the people that had that capacity to operate with emotional intelligence. If you want to go to the Game of Thrones example, there's a moment in season 1 where Daenerys Targaryen, for those of you who don't know the show, she's the daughter of an assassinated king. She's in a foreign land. She's been forced to marry this nomadic leader named Khal Drogo. She's terrified. She embraces the culture of Drogo's people, the Dothraki. She falls, her and her husband find love. It's all starting to work. And part of her approach is to look for wisdom from disenfranchised people. Look for ways to understand herself better by learning from people around her, often people because she's now the Khaleesi or the queen of this nomadic tribe, learning from other people. She comes across a magi, a witch, a healer of this group, the Lazarene, who are being treated badly, to put it mildly, by the Dothraki. And she allows this woman to help her. And the help is not what it's said to be. There's a betrayal. And Daenerys, also known informally in the show as Dany, comes out of it with this self-aware, two kinds of forms of self-awareness. She realizes she can't always trust vulnerable people because they could betray you just as much as powerful people. She lives in a competitive world, and she realizes she has to seek information and really come to terms with whether she can trust people, and this is something that goes all the way through the 8 seasons of the show. And at the end of the first season in the books, there's a saying where she says, "If I look back, I am lost." And she realizes that she has to lead herself forward, even if it means putting herself at risk, because if she doesn't, she's going to lose everything. And at this point, without going into detail, she's already lost a lot. So she steps into this funeral pyre with the body of her dead husband and with the shortly living body of the Magi who she's killing. And she does this to try to build followership from the Dothraki, and she succeeds at it. So there's a moment of self-awareness from her where she realizes she has to push herself forward. Arya Stark, for those of you who don't know the show, is very young, kind of tomboyish daughter of this northern lord, Ned Stark. And Arya doesn't want to be the pretty little daughter. She wants to be a warrior, and many people kind of judge her negatively for that. But her father has got her a Braavosi swordsman known as her dance master, who's been training her in very unique ways in the capital city to learn to fight. And her father's kind of got a bemused acceptance of it, although he wishes she was more like his other daughter, Sansa Stark. And then suddenly everything goes bad. Her father's arrested, and Arya is thrust into a situation where she's terrified, and she has to manage herself. And her Braavosi trainer had told her over and over again, fear cuts deeper than swords. Fear cuts deeper than swords. And so she's repeating these sayings as she's being pursued through the capital by the Queen's army who want to capture her and imprison her. So Arya is very much someone all through the series who sort of learns to manage herself and manage her fear. Another component of EQ is social awareness. Jon Snow is the son, well, we don't really know whose son he is, although there's some thought that he's Ned Stark's son, but he's raised by this Stark family, again, a very noble family, but he's always the outsider. So he's always the one that's kind of having to watch people to understand where he fits in that environment. And he's very good at that. He eventually moves north to this border patrol position on what's called the Night's Watch. He befriends a young man named Samwell Tarly, who becomes an incredible resource in their battle as they're facing a whole number of threats. And he does an exceptional job at understanding everyone until one key moment when he's made a very big strategic decision to bring these nomadic people who are across the border onto their side of the border. And he hasn't done a good job of understanding the resistance that's in his own people. And I won't say more than that. But he, all of us, often even when we're good at something, we stumble. And he stumbles, and to his credit, he comes back from that. Tyrion Lannister, this is an image of Shagga, who's one of these mountain people, and the back of the head of Tyrion as he's holding up a ring to him. Tyrion is the son of a very powerful family, sort of a brutal, cutthroat, politically focused family with a lot of wealth. And Tyrion, in this world, if you're not a big, muscular, aggressive, violent guy, you're sort of disrespected. And Tyrion is short of stature. He doesn't really threaten anyone. So he finds other ways to build relationships with people. And for those of you who don't know the show, one of the most charming, kind of fun relationships is between him and Bronn the Sellsword. Bronn is a mercenary, so Bronn does everything for money. Tyrion has money, and Tyrion says, no matter what happens, remember, I'll always pay more than the person that wants to pay you to kill me. And as the show develops, watching them both struggle, there's moments where, Tyrion wants more. He wants Bronn to be more than a mercenary. And Bronn even seems caught up in that. Like, I wish I could offer you more, but these are my values. I'm a sellsword. I'm a mercenary. And Tyrion, all through the show, particularly later, he goes to Meereen and he approaches Daenerys, who's now in a greater position of power, and he needs to win her over. He needs to build that relationship because her father was murdered by Tyrion's brother. And so all through the narrative, sometimes he succeeds, sometimes he fails, Tyrion works hard at relationship management. So think of EQ as being these 4 categories: self-awareness, self-management. These are things we can all practice every minute of the day: social awareness and relationship management. One of the books that I use in the class and have used from the beginning that is always popular was written in 1941. It feels like it was written last week. If you go online, of course, Amazon will say published in 1993 or something, but it was published in 41, and it's written in the most jazzy, engaging style. Highly recommend it. By Bud Schulberg. Bud Schulberg was the son of a man who grew up in the Lower East Side of New York in the very early part of the 20th century, when the Lower East Side was a ghetto. I moved into the Lower East Side in 1994, and it was still a bit of a ghetto, but in these days, it was really a rough neighborhood. And there's a character named Sammy Glick who grows up in that area, and he goes to become a newspaper employee, and then he kind of cons and manipulates his way into becoming a producer in Hollywood. So the story, What Makes Sammy Run, is a phrase that one of the characters, Al Manheim, keeps saying. Like, I want to understand what drives this guy. Like, his level of ambition is beyond anything I've seen, and his willingness to bend the rules or to betray people or to act in ways that Al doesn't find acceptable. It kind of fascinates Al. And so this novel it's about Hollywood, but it could be about any industry. When my students read it, they all have run into Sammy Glicks, whether they've been in consulting, whether they've been in aerospace, whether they've been in fashion, whatever industry it might be, you're going to run into a Sammy Glick. And one of the great things about this book, and one of the ways it really resonates with my students, and I would sure resonate with all of you, is that you can find moments when maybe you could be a little bit like Sammy. Like, there's one great moment where he's at the newspaper in New York, he calls this person in Hollywood, and he starts just pitching himself, why he should be brought to Hollywood, why he's good. And his methods are a little morally fuzzy, if not flat out manipulative. But when he hangs up, Al Manheim looks at him and goes, what did that feel like? You were kind of amazing. What did that feel like? And he said, all I could hear was Sammy Glick, Sammy Glick, Sammy Glick, Sammy Glick. So all he could hear was his name. And, when we talk about this book in my class, it's not to encourage us to be like Sammy Glick. I mean, there's many ways he's abhorrent. But there are moments in our lives professionally where we have to believe in ourselves. We have to say, hey, why not me? We have to say, I've got no doubts. This is the time for me to pursue something I care about. And so we use that to discuss ambition. As you can imagine, in a group of graduate students, I mean, they're pretty ambitious people. And the question is, how are you going to operate with ambition in a way that helps you fulfill your goals, like Frederick Douglass, and how are you going to follow ambition in a way that doesn't cost you too much, that you're not paying a high price because you're not thinking about your behavior. We tie that to a peer-to-peer coaching exercise, so people practice helping each other through coaching, through asking questions. You could all practice this tonight, with someone just sitting there and each taking 15-minute turns, kind of asking the other person questions, listening to them, and helping them think through their challenges. I do a lot of coaching with senior executives around the world. In every case, they know 99% more about everything they're talking about than I do, and the coaching skill is really often just listening and just helping them think their way through their challenges. I like this quote from this ancient samurai who said, think lightly of yourself and think deeply of the world. I haven't got any tattoos in a while, but it's one I would probably happily get, as it's one that I think always kind of helps me think about the work I do. And in coaching, so much of it is to think, lightly about yourself, but try to help the other person think about themselves. I used a novel called When the Killing's Done. I don't know if you're familiar with T.C. Boyle. If you're not, he's one of our greatest living American novelists. He lives in kind of the Santa Barbara area. And this book is based on a real event that happened in the Channel Islands when this group of scientists made the decision to get rid of the invasive rats and feral pigs, and I believe it was the golden eagles that were killing the local kit foxes. And what had happened was basically this isolated, pristine area of the Channel Islands, which is longer than Manhattan, was being destroyed by these invasive species. And so he writes this novel that involves primarily two characters. Alma, who's on the side of the Park Service and science and is willing to go in and have the feral pigs shot and having the rats poisoned and getting rid of the invasive animals so that the native species can be nurtured and brought back and not lost to extinction. So the kit fox, they have one at the Living Desert, can survive. And she comes into conflict with a guy named Dave LaJoy, who thinks the killing of any animal is wrong. And so killing pigs and killing rats is not justified even if you're saving another species. And so the book is very much about this tension, and we use it in the class, and I think one of the great takeaways from it is we can't always have win-win situations. I mean, we can have win-win situations in that Dave and Alma can learn to communicate better, but you can't have the feral pigs on the island and have the native species and the kit fox and the more fragile animals. They can't coexist. So leadership sometimes is just about making choices. The character of Alma was based on a real woman named Lotus Vermeer, and I had the pleasure of talking to her on the phone, and she said it was very hard for her to support the idea of killing these animals, of just hunting them all and killing them, but at the same time she felt that at the end of the day, saving certain species from extinction trumped that, and was more important, and so she agreed with making that choice. And then she said it was amazing to go back out on the Channel Islands. And I have not been there, so I still want to plan a vacation there, but apparently now it's a place where people really love to go and see how it's been brought back. I used the play True West, which was set not far from where I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, which is about two brothers that really don't understand themselves. They have a great business opportunity, but they blow it because they don't understand themselves. It's a play that was written in 1980, and still it just recently had a big performance on Broadway here and in the UK. And the takeaway from this is really that we're all benefit from understanding our history. And one thing you could do it again tonight, you could do it with classmates, with friends, with family, you could do it over a bottle of wine, whatever, is take a big piece of paper and write at the bottom, where you were born, in my case, Burbank, and then move up the paper with some kind of line or some kind of organizing principle, and then just put different events in your life, where you went to school, parents, family, friends, successes, failures. We do this with our MBA students, and we do it with our senior executives. And what happens is that people start sharing these. They're called lifelines. You start sharing a lifeline, and you realize that people you're really in contact with pretty significantly have whole elements of their life that you don't understand. And so on one level, it's a great way to understand people better. It's also, I started realizing, I've made many lifelines, and suddenly at one point I'd go, oh, right, that moment with my grandmother, or, oh, yeah, that one time my friend helped me with this. It helps you recognize kind of the experiences in your life that have shaped you. So that's something I would always recommend. Here are the books we were just talking about, the books that I use in the course, the themes that we've been talking about, over our brief hour here together. And really, I do strongly believe that we can all choose to engage with fiction and see it through this lens. You can come up with ideas and be sending them to me in over the next 6 months, and before I know it, I'll be bringing them into my classroom because this is a methodology that really seems to work. I want to encourage all of you to think of your own life as a hero's journey and push yourself into those moments of separation, initiation, learning, and return. And just to end this, I'd like to read, because I do have this book of poetry coming out, I'd like to read one poem. It's called Gun Crazy, and it's based on a film noir movie called Gun Crazy. So we're just going to shift into the poetry mode here for a second. Gun crazy. I'm a failure I fell in love with the sharpshooting girl with pearl-handled pistols in white holsters and the short skirt trimmed with fringe. We shot 6 shooters together, then she came around the corner in a Buick with running boards and a hood ornament that shined like God's right eye in the Kansas sun. Her patent leather boots were ice cream white, same as those dangerous holsters and the yoke of her midnight blue silk rodeo shirt. White as her teeth and the fake pearl snaps. Her small bosom unveiled in the carnival noise of sweeping up, the sound of a generator, voices from a distant poker game. I'm almost scared. Her breasts in my hands make me think of mounds of warm dirt when I was a boy, sitting beside the lake. I leaned against a big rock out past the drive-in and took pot shots at birds in the sky with my Crossman Pell gun, dreaming of coyote, catamount, wolf. And now the towns don't know what hit them. Bank alarms clang, people wave their arms or lie down on the sidewalk, and we count the money and drive. My love can pick a lit cigarette out of my lips from 30 feet with her eyes closed. My love can hold an empty beer can bouncing in the air on bullets like it was bouncing down from heaven on a string. My love can talk for hours, then sleep curled in the shotgun seat with her head in my lap, her arm between her legs. And the road never ends, and she only complains about the heat. And this engine is a gem, an oiled gun that fires fast and smooth. You know they're never going to catch you. We got married on the run, like real lovers should, she whispered to me. Like criminals, joked the man in Reno, who sold us a couple boxes of 38 shells, a bottle of rye, and an extra blanket for the cold desert nights. Then we reached the ocean, the big blue desert, where the Buick is useless. During day, we hide in our hotel room and pay cash. At night, we walk the sand and don't talk anymore. Tonight, the waves spill in moonlight. We made a fire out of driftwood and finished the rye. I held a cigarette in my lips under the carousel of stars. Her shot ripped the cherry spark, and I jumped like it was the first time. My love's breasts are small and beautiful, and she trembles under me now in the cold sand and cries, not from our passion, but because she shot a man in the back of a savings and loan, back near San Bernardino. 3 shots. He was armed, that's what the newspapers say. He died. Newspapers calling us killers, calling us another Bonnie and Clyde. Shown a big picture of the Buick, big pictures of me and my love. I told you I was bad, she says. I failed you, I say. She wipes her tears and lifts her pistol. No, you didn't. But she's wrong. We got nowhere to drive. We got nowhere to hide. My love points her gun at the sky and fires. The stars crackle. We got nothing but each other. We see it before we hear it. The flash of their blue gunfire. Well, thank you for indulging me on the poem.